Creating great content, finding an audience, building engagement, monetizing your blog. This is ProBlogger.
Hi friends, and welcome to today's Facebook Live training session where I want to talk to you about creating content for your blog and podcast and live stream, or however you're creating content, even if it's for live events. And I'm going to take you through my step-by-step content creation workflow. And this is a workflow that I've developed over the last 18 or so years of creating content online. And in fact, a lot of it I was actually doing before I started creating content online, because previous to creating content online as a blogger, I was working in churches and with young people, and I was doing a lot of public speaking, preaching in churches, but also speaking at different events. And the workflow that I use today to create content is actually not that different to the workflow I used to come up with when I was creating presentations and slides and a workflow for a presentation. So I think what I'm going to share today, a lot of it is going to be relevant no matter what kind of content creation you do. So I'm going to share some slides with you today. I will say right up front that this might seem a little bit regimented. A lot of this just naturally happens for me now. It's something that has evolved over time, and it kind of just naturally happens. I don't have a checklist that I go through. It just naturally kind of flows as I'm creating content. Some of it is kind of logical, and a lot of you will probably be doing some of this already, but I kind of wanted to go through it because I know a lot of new bloggers really do struggle with this process. Okay, so I've kind of arranged it into 13 steps, and hopefully it won't take too long to go through it. The first one is pretty logical in some ways. It is to choose a topic. And I'm going to talk here mainly about writing a blog post, but you translate this to however you create content. So choosing a topic. Now, I know some people actually really struggle with this part, particularly bloggers who've been blogging for a while. They feel like they've run out of things to say. And I've written a lot on this topic in the past, so I'm not going to go over it in great detail, but mostly for me, the topics that I choose come from questions that I get asked, particularly here on lives and on YouTube, in the comments section, but also in the comments of blog posts as well. And that is because most of my content is how-to content. And so I do get asked a lot of questions about, how do you do this? Or here's a problem that I have, how do I solve this? So for me, most of it does start with a question that I'm asked or a problem that I observe in my readers. It could also be a process that someone asks me to outline, which is kind of a question as well. But usually my topics start with these types of things, or it might start with a goal that I know my readers want to reach. So, for example, how do I become a full-time blogger? Or how do I make a living from photography? I talk a lot about blogging and photography, but it could also be, how do I get more creative control of my camera? How do I go through that process? How do I reach that goal? So there's a variety of things there that can stimulate the choosing of a topic. And I guess the last one there is a motivation or an inspiration. And some of my content, not a lot of it, but some of it is more about trying to motivate people and inspire people as well. But for me, most of it does come from the questions and the problems that I observe. So choose a topic. Number one. Number two, and I think this is so important to get in the habit of doing, is to remind yourself of your reader. Your content is going to be read by people. It's going to be listened to by people. It's going to be watched by people. And you need to really put yourself in the shoes of those people and think about who they are. So who is your reader? Maybe you've created an avatar, maybe rereading that avatar or having it pinned up in front of you, which is something I did in the early days. I created a reader profile and I actually had it stuck next to my computer. So every time I sat down to write a blog post, there was my reader sitting in front of me, or at least a hypothetical reader. I found that so useful. Why do they need the content that you're about to write? Actually put yourself in their shoes and imagine how they are. How are they feeling about the topic that you're about to write about? Are they anxious about it? Are they upset about it? Are they excited about it? Put yourself in their shoes, and you're going to write with more empathy. What experiences have they had as it pertains to the topic that you're writing about? This is something that I remind myself of every time I create content on ProBlogger. I know a lot of our readers have actually had a couple of years of experience of blogging, and they haven't had that success that they've been dreaming of. And so there's elements for some of our readers of pain or frustration. And to actually remind yourself of that is really a powerful thing, because it enables you to write in a much more compassionate, empathetic voice. Some other things are what's the situation that they're in? What resources do they have? For example, when I'm writing for photography blog, digital photography blog, in the early days of that, I realized a lot of the readers that we had didn't have fancy cameras. They didn't have fancy lighting gear. They had a very simple camera. And so to actually remind myself, actually, they're not as advanced as me. They don't have the gear that I might have. That is a great reminder as I went into writing content. And what level are they at? Are they beginners? Are they intermediate? Are they advanced? Are they a mixture of those things? That's really useful to keep in mind before you start creating content. What are they searching for? And in here, I'm thinking about what are they plugging into Google to find the topic that you're writing about. Keeping those exact words in the back of your mind is really useful as well. What are their aspirations? What are their goals? What barriers are they facing? What challenges do they have? And lastly, what do I want my readers to do at the end of the blog post? And how do I want them to be? How do I want them to feel at the end? What am I moving them towards? All of these things are really great questions just to have in the back of your mind as you sit down to write a blog post or to record your podcast, because they're going to help you to create so much more useful content. So actually keeping those things in mind is really useful. We actually have a little worksheet that can help you work through who your reader is if you haven't created an avatar yet. It's courses.problogger.com/member-library. It's a free download for you. There's a few other worksheets there as well. But if you haven't created a worksheet, an avatar like that, I think that's really useful. But just even asking yourself those questions that I've just gone through. Who is my reader? What are they feeling? What's their experience? What level are they at? Those types of things are really useful. Okay, number 3, identify the point of your content. What is the purpose of the content that you're about to create? You've reminded yourself of the reader and who they are. Now, what is the point of this content? And if there's no point, you might want to rethink your topic because great content actually changes people's lives in some way. And that might be a little change, like making someone laugh, bringing a smile to their face, making them feel like they're not the only one, or it might be teaching them something, or it might be leading them through a process, might be giving them inspiration, updating them on the latest news. All of these things bring about a change in people. So what's the point of the content that you're going to create? What type of content is it? Is it how-to content? Is it inspirational content? Is it a storytelling content? Is it a review? These things just, you probably don't even think intentionally about that, but actually giving it a little bit of thought at the start can really lift the content as well. Okay, we're about to start creating the content. What I do, and not every blogger does this, but I usually come up with a working title. And it's rare that this title ends up being the headline title of my blog post, but I like to have it in front of me. And usually it's something like how to do this. Usually it has some sort of a benefit. Usually it has that change I'm trying to bring for my readers in it. And I will tweak this later, but I find it's really useful to have a bit of a title in front of me as I'm creating my content. Once I've got a working title, I usually start to brainstorm. And because my posts tend to be how-to content, and they tend to be sort of medium to longer form content, I like to outline my main points before I start writing. I'm not a writer who comes up with my points as I write. I like to know how the article or how the podcast or how the live stream will actually flow. And for me, I tend to use mind mapping these days. And I use a tool called MindNode, which creates mind maps like this. And this is kind of going to cover my face a little bit here, but here's a mind map that I created for a video I did a few months ago now on how to face COVID-19 as a blogger. And this was done in MindNode. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read all this, although if you put this full screen, maybe you'll be able to there. But you can see right there in the center, this bit here is the title, the working title, COVID-19 and bloggers. That was my working title. And then I began to brainstorm what kind of categories could I cover in this content. So the next layer around my title there are, what does the world need? What does the world not need from bloggers right now? What will we do as bloggers? What should we avoid as bloggers? Can we monetize in this time? And the good thing as bloggers, we're positioned to make a difference in the world right now. So I brainstormed that layer there, and then I began to brainstorm out further. And you can see there, I'm not writing the blog post, or I'm not writing a script. I'm just coming up with potentially some headings for my article or for my podcast or for my video, and then some subheadings as well. And so by actually beginning to grow this mind map, I've now got the beginning of an outline. Now, you might do this process as a mind map, or you might do it in bullet points, or you might do it on a whiteboard, or you might have a piece of paper. I personally just find having that mind map is a nice visual thing. And the thing I love about that kind of mind map is that MindNode actually allows me to drag these nodes. I could take this node right here and I could move it down to here, and I can actually begin to order the mind mapping that I'm doing and the outline that I have. So I'm brainstorming my main points, and by doing so, I'm basically listing those points. And then once I've kind of got that mind map, I begin to go through it and I get a bit critical about it. I cull the things that just aren't right. So the mind map that I just showed you there is after I've culled it and I've begun to put it into the right order. The early stage of brainstorming, there's nothing that's wrong to put on that mind map. I put it all on there, but then I began to cull it. So you need to bring some critical thought, some critique to it. And you're actually going to hear me talk about this process of critiquing again and again during this process. I think it's really important as bloggers, as podcasters, to not just come up with all kinds of stuff, but to actually, during this workflow, actually cull it back down and to be critical about it, to put on that sort of more judgmental mind. And so that's what I'm doing here as I look at my outline. And then I begin to order the points. And so when I'm doing it on the mind map, I just literally drag the points around, get them in the order of how I think the article will flow. And I'm particularly looking for a logical flow. I'm outlining my draft. And at this point, there's not really many words. If it's going to be an article, it's usually just my headings and subheadings. So I begin to get a feel for that. At this point, I begin to critique it. I put on that judgmental kind of brain hat, if you like, and I begin to ask myself, is this flowing right? Is this useful content? You can usually tell in this outline stage whether it's going to be good or not. If it's going to be useful at this stage, I keep going. If it's not, I go back and refine the topic and refine that draft. What questions is it going to lead to in my reader, in my listener, in my viewer? I try and anticipate the questions I'm going to get at the end of a presentation or at the end of a blog post, so that I can then incorporate the answers to those questions into the content I'm creating. So it's really important during this sort of critique stage to anticipate those questions and objections. Then I look at the outline and I say, where are the gaps? What don't I know enough about at this point to be able to talk about it? So if I'm writing an article on ProBlogger about search engine optimization, there's going to be gaps in my knowledge there that I don't know, that I am not equipped to answer because I'm not an SEO expert. And so noting the things I don't know is really important because it will inform the things I need to go and find out. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Anticipate any objections that people have and refine that outline. So you've got your outline, refine it, rework it, get it in the right order, get it so that it will flow better. Once I've done that, I then begin to research. Now, sometimes the research for me actually comes a bit earlier, and sometimes it even comes as I'm writing the content as well. But this I think is one of the most important parts of creating content, because if you just write from your outline, you're going to create a good piece of content, but it could be so much better if you've done some research before you're actually writing. So I read, I go and see what other people have written. I try and find podcasts or videos on YouTube. I try and see what other people have written, not so that I can copy them, but so that I can quote them, so that I can learn from them, so that I can embed their content into my content, so that I can make my content better in lots of ways. So I'm asking questions. Sometimes I'm physically tweeting people and saying, hey, do you know the answer to this? Because I'm writing an article on it. Or I might email a friend, or I might call someone, do a Skype session with someone. I might actually record an interview with someone for the podcast. Ask questions of people. Follow those little curiosities and hunches that you have, and put aside some reasonable time to dig into what other people have written. Find quotes, take note of what other people have actually said, and take notes as you go. And lastly, record your sources. I think it's so important as you gather information to actually record the sources so that you can credit people as well. So you can link to other blog posts and podcasts and give people the credit for teaching you. So research is really important at this stage. And at this point, I begin to write. And for me, I start with my intro. The heading, the title is all about trying to get people to read the intro. And then your introduction is all about trying to introduce the topic and get people to read the whole article. And so some things I try and achieve in my intro really is to identify the question or the problem that the article is going to solve. I think you really need to communicate that clearly up front, to empathize with your reader, to show them that you understand who they are and the situation that they're in, and then to promise a benefit of reading the article. These are the three things I try and incorporate into the introduction of a blog post or a podcast or even a talk that I'm giving. Notice here I've said it's a draft. This is something that I will come back to later on. After I've refined my title, I'll refine the draft. Then just to talk a little bit about where I write my content, because I know some of you are going to be asking about tools. For me, I'm at this point either writing in text edit. I'm on a Mac, so it's just a little app on the Mac. It's probably the most basic editing tool that you can have, or Google Documents, or I also use Notion, which is a writing tool that you can use as well. But for me, it's not so much about the tool, it's about just trying to get it out in a clear space. I like to go full screen and just have the content in front of me at this stage as I'm beginning to write my articles. Once I've got my introduction, I then go back to that mind map and I begin to expand the main points. I will work through the mind map sequentially and I'll write a paragraph or 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs about each section. I try and come up with heading, subheading, sub-subheading, and actually break it down as I'm writing. I find that's really useful for me to break down the article, make it more achievable to write, but also I find that's much easier for my reader to read. And the same is true if I'm doing a presentation. I try and break it down, and you can see what I'm doing here with these slides. I've got my main headings, and then I've got sub-points that I'm making as well. It's easier to listen to, it's easier to watch, and it's easier to read. It's easier for you to deliver as well. So I'm breaking it down, I'm working through the sub-points. I write in the order that the article will flow. I just find that if I want my article to flow in a logical order, I want my article or my podcast to one step leads to another step, which leads to another step. I'm very much into the flow and designing that. And so I find personally that I'm much better if I'm writing in the same order that my reader is going to listen to it in. I also, and this is something that I guess I've done more and more over the years, is taken note of the tangents that I'm tempted to take as I'm writing and the questions that I imagine my readers will ask as I'm writing. I try and write in a conversational tone, and so I'm always imagining what's someone going to be thinking at this point? How are they going to be confused at this point? And I take note of those things so that I can then add those answers or those, I can refine what I'm writing so that I can anticipate those questions. And I also find that if I take note of the tangents I'm tempted to take, I sometimes will come up with new blog post ideas for future content as well. Once I've kind of expanded my content, and that section there, number 9, is where I spend most of my time, I then work on a draft, conclusion, and call to action. I love this quote from Aristotle: tell them what you'll say, that's your introduction, tell them, that's the main body of your content, and then tell them what you just told them, that's your conclusion. And so you effectively introduce your topic by telling them what's going to happen in the article, you then tell them, and then you summarize what you've told them. And so your conclusion, your call to action is to sum it all up and to keep those calls to action really simple. I don't think you should ask your readers or viewers to do too many things at the end of your article. The less you ask them to do, the more likely they'll do the one thing that you do ask them to do. Again, I try and put on my judgmental critique hat at this point, and once I've written a draft, I then ask myself again, is it useful? What questions will my readers still be asking? What didn't I cover? What objections do my readers potentially have? And then I take all of that and I try and refine and rework. It may be at this point I realize I need to add another section, or maybe I've talked too much about one thing and I need to cull it back in some way. So critiquing is again a really useful thing. Once I've kind of got that, I'm happy with the content. I'm happy with the order, and then I want to polish it up. A lot of people just hit publish at this point. Take a little time to polish and craft that content into something that's not just good, but something that's great. Rework your title, rework that introduction. Really think not just about the title of your blog post, but any subheadings that you've got. People will scan your content, particularly if it's written, to see whether it's going to be relevant. And so the same kind of techniques that you might use in your title of your article to intrigue people and to invite them to read your introduction, actually bring those same principles into subheadings as well. Add further reading. not only stuff that you've written before, but other people as well. Add images, visualize, make your content much more visual, make it scannable. So the subheadings are really useful, images are really useful, maybe some bolding, maybe you need to add some bullet lists in some way. Maybe you want to add some embeddable content. Maybe there's a YouTube clip that someone else has created that you could include somehow. Maybe there's a tweet or an Instagram post that you've done in the past or someone else has done in the past that you can embed into your content to make it more visual in some way. All of this lifts your content. All of this adds depth to it. All of this makes it go from good to great. Once I've done that, I'm editing and I'm proofreading. I'm not going to go through how I do that in great detail, because how I do it is to hand it off to someone else to do that process. But I have done a podcast, episode 168, on 7 steps to edit your content. And there's some tips in there for those of you who are just working by yourself as well. Okay, so that's the process. At that point, I'm then publishing my content as well. Whew. Okay, so that's the process. That's the 13 steps. Thank you for those little thumbs up and likes that I see going on there on the live. I hope that has been useful for you. I do want to mention, before I get into questions and answers, our content sprints that are coming up. We have, if you do want to practice this process, we have these 3 content sprints that are coming up over the next 3 months. They're only $7 each. They're a week of content delivered to you privately, although there's about 100 people already signed up to do this, and there'll be more by then. You can sign up to do it, and basically at the end of this process, you will have created 6 new pieces of content for your blog or your podcast at the end of every sprint. So if you do all 3 of them, you'll create 18 pieces of content, and I will walk you through how to create those pieces of content and give you some suggestions on what you can do as well. So problogger.com/content sprint. Grove shared the link in the comments there for us as well.